With the increasing accuracy and popularity of AI translation, as well as colleges already cutting language departments, the state of language learning is looking a bit rough. But never fear. That doesn't mean language learning is futile. Today I'll be talking about favorite books by Japanese female authors that are untranslated. Just to highlight the pleasure of language learning and encourage you to keep going despite what people in your life might say. Welcome fellow Curiosos, old and new. I'm C, and this is my channel, Useless Genius. I'm no genius, but that's okay. This channel is dedicated to all things that other people might deem useless. Like, unfortunately, language learning, which, yes, it requires time and investment, whereas AI is free and, only costs you your soul and the environment. So, what are you gonna do? Anyways, my point being that I think language learning is still incredibly valuable, and for me, through Japanese, I've been able to read so much amazing literature that has never been translated. And while there are a lot of excellent translators out there, oftentimes whether a translation will be published has to do with what people in the US think is going to be valuable and sell on the market. So there's so much untranslated, beautiful literature out there. One of the things that actually raised my awareness to this was that one of my favorite books of the last few years was The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This was before I started studying Japanese, and when I looked on the back of the book, I noticed that the original was published almost 25 years before, which is crazy to me. So today I want to highlight some other literature that hasn't been translated, but I think is really, really great. And at the end of the video, I'll give a little spiel about where I think language learning is heading. So stick around for that. Okay, on to the recommendations. This video is English, and I assume most of the audience is English speakers. I'm going to be using Number 1. First we have Kiiroi Ie by Mieko Kawakami. This is one of the more recent books on this list. It came out, I think, last year, 2 years ago. And it's a neo-noir novel by truly one of my favorite authors right now, Mieko Kawakami. You may know her from her breakout novel in English, which was Breast and Eggs. It was translated from the Japanese book Natsu Monogatari. It's an extension of her novella, which won the prestigious Akutagawa Prize in Japan. She's known for her honest portrayal of the lives of working-class women, and this latest book is no exception. When it comes to crime novels, they usually star either an outsider coming into the world looking to disrupt it, or a kind of anti-hero who is at the center of this underground. Yet, this book stars typically the characters who are like the victims of this type of novel, which is women who are kind of at the lower end of this underworld nightlife hierarchy. I say women, but our main characters are 3 teenage girls who are the quote-unquote sisters in yellow. The Sisters in Yellow, I think, is a reference to the Makioka sisters, a famous novel by Junichiro Tanizaki, which Mieko Kawakami has said she was directly inspired by. We are introduced to our 3 characters after they are reunited as adults when the woman that they used to live with is arrested for financial crimes, harassment, and detaining someone against their will. Yet they're not really surprised given what they saw during their time with her. This causes our main character, Hana, to reflect on the past, and we see the story through her eyes. Teenage Hana is a hard-working and determined girl who's living with her single mother. She's focused on saving money that she earns from her part-time job and wants to better her lot in life. However, this all collapses when her mother's boyfriend steals thousands of dollars from her. She decides to run away from home and moves in with her mother's slightly eccentric friend, Kimiko. Kimiko is the one who loves yellow, as it represents money, good fortune, and all the things that Hana aspires to. They even have a little yellow shrine in their house. Together, the two open up a bar called Lemon, and soon after, a wealthy runaway named Momoko and a hostess called Ran move in with them. The 3 become a sort of found family. Which, let me pause and explain what a hostess club is for the uninitiated, as it's very important for the context of the story. Basically, these are clubs where men can pay a premium fee to drink with a young woman, often in very tight or revealing clothing. I have been to one, actually. When I worked in a school in rural Japan, sometimes after work, the teachers would go as part of like a drinking party. I went there once and was not particularly impressed, as, you know, I'm a young woman. I do not have to pay to talk to young women. But people were enjoying themselves, so who am I to judge? This is really just context for the background of the story. Honestly, my time in rural Japan, that could be a whole other video. Anyways, back to the novel. This is certainly a lighter part, as the characters are working hard and long nights, but in general, they're making money and they're forming bonds. They are able to relate to each other in ways that they never received from the other adults in their life. And Kimiko-san becomes a maternal figure. However, this club burns down. Something always has to go wrong in these types of novels. So because she left her ID at home when she ran away, Hana can't get a normal job or open a bank account. Hana is introduced to Kimiko-san's friend, Vivian, and Vivian teaches her the art of credit card. Soon, Hana is draining unknowing strangers' bank accounts. Is this ideal? No. And she feels a little bit bad, but she also knows that she can't survive without it. After all, Hana is supporting all three of the girls, which starts to lead to some resentment. The money, the yellow, so to speak, that brought them all together now becomes a corrosive force. Now, the arc of this story is nothing unique. Friends who chase money ultimately fall into an underbelly and go deeper and deeper, and they realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. You know, we've heard that story a lot of times. However, what I think makes Kawakami's story unique is her matter-of-fact writing about the subject. She doesn't judge the morality of the girls, she really just paints how they came to their decisions and how they were pushed to desperation. Yet she also doesn't show that they're entirely blameless or that they're necessarily just victims. She shows how ordinary people can make moral justifications to themselves and how we're often pushed into becoming very individualistic because our society revolves so much around monetary concerns and what happens when those dictate every aspect of your life. The story is not told to be salacious, but to build empathy and understanding. In an interview with Tokuin magazine, Kawakami says, quote, "The driving force behind it was wanting to witness and document so many things about being human, like the helplessness, hardships, beauty, and energy that comes with it. I don't think anyone has the right to judge those who live in the elusive present with desperation and choose a life of their own from the choices they were given. The world is full of people like Hana." You can see this humanism in the conclusion, as the story doesn't wrap up neatly. You're left with the sense that the characters are continuing their own lives after you close the pages of the book shut. I'm really curious how the translation will hit international audiences. You can pre-order it on the Penguin website or through your local bookstore, so check it out if you're curious. Now on to the next recommendation. The next novel is The Sustainable Use of Our Souls by Aoko Matsuda. How to describe this book? It takes place in two worlds. One is the real world, the one where women have to survive in a world that is often antagonistic to them with various forms of harassment. I know that a lot of people know about the women-only cards in Japan, and another where all of the old men causing this harassment have disappeared. Women are finally free to express what they had to remain silent on in order to continue their lives. I think this is an interesting complement to a Haruki Murakami novel, Men Without Women, which focuses on men who are struggling after the loss of women in their lives, relationship breakups, or death. In contrast to the first novel I recommended, this one is driven more as like a philosophical or political exercise rather than very or character-driven story. I think that some audiences might not be as interested in that type of novel, perfectly fine, but for me, one thing I love about literature is how expansive it can be and how different authors are always pushing what we think a story can look like, the shapes and forms and types of things that we find entertaining. They can show us new ways of thinking about the world around us, and I think that's so beautiful. Matsuda explains this in an interview where she says, quote, "There are so many people out there whose stories that don't get told, so I tried to catch their voices and tell their stories. In Japan, where I live, the literary establishment doesn't want literature to be political. If you write about the patriarchal system, they discount it as literature. but I believe it's really important to show how that system works, so I'm always writing about it. I think that she is right to consider the system, because when she's talking about patriarchy, she's not just talking about an abstract concept, she's talking about something that affects the real lives of women in Japan. In 2025, Japan ranked 114 out of 148 countries in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report. For example, Japanese women are not allowed to have names independent of their husband's surname. Women's wages are typically 70 to 80% of what men make. And unlike in other parts of the world where women are surpassing men in terms of college enrollment and graduation, currently only 46% of college students are women, and that drops at top universities like Tokyo University, where women make only 20% of the incoming class in 2025. As recently as 2018, there was a huge scandal revealing that medical universities manipulated female applications in order to keep enrollment numbers under 30%. Now, in 2025, that number has risen to 40%. So luckily, there are improvements. And as of the recording of this video, there are currently no laws on paper that protect women from sexual harassment at the workplace or protect those who report it. Which, of course, because this is the internet, I must clarify that this is not to single out Japan or to say that the entire country is like this. Obviously, I have met plenty of kind, lovely Japanese men that I've worked with or just know in my personal life. Sexual harassment and treatment of women is a problem around the world. It certainly is in my country of the US. This is about a novel obviously written by a Japanese woman set in Japan, so I'm merely adding in context about some of the specific issues that women in Japan face. And to be fair, the Japanese government has acknowledged these issues and previously said that it is working to improve them. So I just want to cover all my bases there. Now, let's move on to the next book. The next book is Higambana ga Sakushima, which is a novel by Kotomi Ki. It would be translated into English as The Island Where the Red Spider Lilies Bloom. Probably never hear it translated. Of course, anyone could translate anything, but there would have to be some really difficult choices made in order to preserve. This book is specifically about language acquisition. Our main character, Umi, wakes up on an island with no memories, and she has to learn how to fit into the culture of the island. One of the first things she has to learn is, of course, the island's language, which is somewhat related to her own language, yet there's a lot of gaps in terms of vocabulary and, of course, the culture in which it's used. There's also a specific language to women that is passed down through a matriarchal line and is used in specific religious context. The book becomes a depiction of Umi's education and assimilation into the island society. I would say it comes off more as like a documentary or anthropological study than a heavily plot-driven novel. However, as the story unfolds, we get more clues as to what happened before Umi came to the island, and we get some context about the possible real-world equivalents to this novel's allegory. Have you ever noticed that in most novels, the issue of language is rarely broached? I'll speak for English media when talking here, since that's what I'm most familiar with. Often, the characters are either all miraculously speak English, or there's like one note that's like, they're all speaking French right now, and then we might drop a, bonjour in italics so that you know, they're still speaking French. Or worse, when someone is from the global south, we might not even be told what language they're speaking, just that they're speaking, for example, a Middle Eastern language or an African language. When, Africa, for example, is a continent with thousands of language groups, and someone might even speak multiple languages in a different context, depending on their ethnic and religious background. So I think we could do a little more research here. My point being that the language that we use is going to impact the way that we communicate our ideas. And oftentimes, linguistics aren't really acknowledged except when a oftentimes very stereotypical character is given a really heavy accent or, speaks in quote-unquote like broken English. However, these depictions tend to make the non-native speaker character seem like an other. However, it should really make us consider what the limitations of our own language are and what we lose when we reduce the world to one language. This is one of the problems inherent in translation, though it's not translators' fault. Obviously, the goal of modern translation is to make stories from around the world accessible to those who are monolingual, which this is just an inherent problem in any media. When you start having multiple languages spoken without a translation, then that's limiting the pool of people who can, watch said media. But I just think it's something to consider, to be more aware of. And this novel really grasps with that issue, just in Japanese. So now I'm going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of that Japanese. So here's a really quick overview. In Japanese, there are 3 writing systems: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Hiragana and katakana are syllabaries, so they can be read phonetically, and they're often a sound and vowel pairing. Hiragana is used for all types of words, native Japanese words. It's used to conjugate grammar and show sound effects. Katakana, on the other hand, tends to be a tool for depicting foreign words, such as turning internet into interneto, and pan for the French word for bread, pan. Pan, that was not right. That's like an American, frying pan. Katakana can be used to add also just a little bit of extra flair to language, almost like all caps in English. The most passive-aggressive, let's say, use is sometimes on the news when a Japanese anchor person will be interviewing someone from another country. Then they will put a subtitle in katakana to illustrate that the person is, speaking poor Japanese or heavily accented Japanese, which I think really ends up just highlighting being outside of a very, at times, insular culture. More on this later. And last, we have kanji, which are characters that were imported from China via the Korean peninsula in the 5th century. They can be marked up and actually read as Japanese in a tradition called ganbun. Actually, Japanese school students still learn this technique today. The Chinese characters were used by elites as a form of writing for political and government communications. Of course, now they are widely used throughout Japanese, and there are about 2,100 in common use called the Joyo kanji. There are, however, dictionaries full of tens of thousands of kanji, and an entire exam dedicated to them. You can look it up later. They can also be combined with hiragana or katakana to create new unique words. So in the novel, the author Kotomiki plays with these 3 writing systems as a way of delineating between these 3 different languages that are spoken on the island. So what are these languages, you might ask? Well, they're not made up entirely. Basically, the first character, Umi, who is the stranger on the island, speaks only words that are native to Japanese. So these are words written in katakana, or might have one kanji, but then a kana afterwards. To this character, words imported from Chinese that have a Japanese reading are foreign to her. Katakana is used to show areas of misunderstanding between her and the residents of the island, which speak this other language. The other language is called Nihongo, the Japanese word for Japanese. However, Nihon, the part that means Japan, is written in katakana. This is meant to illustrate how modern Japanese is actually a combination of not just native words, but also of words imported from China and given a Japanese pronunciation. How from the outside, these words appear to be foreign. When you separate out only Japanese origin words, you would get another language entirely. I think it's a slight rebuke to nationalists who want to retain 100% cultural purity in everything and excise foreign influence. As I mentioned before, there's a third language, which is called onago, or women's language. This language is used as part of the religious tradition and is passed down through a matriarchal line. I think this is a nod to the impact that women had on the development of Japanese. Back in the 8th century, high-class men were becoming more and more well-versed through kanji and began to apply their own Japanese readings to the words. This was called manyodana. A simplified form, hiragana, which I mentioned earlier, yes, that hiragana, was used by women. Elite women in the court would use it to write letters and literature. In fact, one of the first novels in the world, The Tale of Genji, was written by a court lady named Murasaki Shikibu. So, once again, I think our author here is highlighting how people, such as foreigners and women who are often denied social power in Japan, are actually essential to the language which makes up the country's identity. With all this consideration given to language, I think it's worth pointing out that our author, Kotomiki, is Taiwanese. She learned Japanese in high school, and I think that this shows through her careful consideration of the language. After all, when you learn a language as an adult, you often have to start from the ground up, learn the grammar, and learn the history alongside it because you don't just have this natural intuition for the language. You don't know how many times a Japanese person has asked me to explain some English grammar rule, and I just have never heard of it. and they'll ask me, why does it apply in this situation? Why doesn't it apply in this situation? And I'm like, I don't know, man, just the vibes. I'm just going on vibes here. So if you're just dying to read this book, but you don't have time to learn Japanese, then I would recommend the book The Emissary, which has been translated into English, and it actually won the National Book Award. It's also a story that uses very playful language and has some social commentary on Japan's future. Okay, and that is a wrap on my recommendation. So I hope that this was interesting and maybe tipped you off to some new authors, or it made you more curious about either the world of Japanese literature or just untranslated literature in general, whatever your target language may be. I know there's a lot of understandable panic about the future of translation, but I just really hope that literary translations still get funded and that these translators get the support that they need, because there's such a wealth of work out there and they need support for their research and work. Of course, realistically, the market is going to shrink due to, AI and greed, flat out. Personally, I think language learning might see a renaissance and become a kind of like boutique hobby in the way that one might learn calligraphy or hand sewing, even though most people are satisfied typing on their computer or using a sewing machine. Even if you can get the end result quickly, I think it's really great that there will always be people who want to know the how and why behind something. A text is so much more than just your literal meaning that comes from it. It has to do with the sentence structure and the feelings that evokes. And I think there's also just a unique pleasure in learning a skill at a high level that allows you to do something that you couldn't do before. And before someone says, why do you hate AI? Like, we have AI now. Well, this isn't completely anti-AI. I think language technology can be really great. It can provide great assistance for people with learning disabilities, and it allows people who maybe don't have the resources to learn English to reach a wider audience and potentially have opportunities that they wouldn't have had before. Obviously, even the savants among us can never learn every language, so having more widely accessible and accurate translation software can be really helpful. However, I hope that people will not forget the art of and enjoyment of learning another language, especially when there's some languages that only have an oral tradition or might not have enough text that can be through AI, and I don't want these languages to be lost. We've already seen cases where digitization has led to a reduced use of certain languages. Languages are also inherently tied to the culture that they're a part of, and when it comes to being able to engage with the culture, at least for now, I think people are always going to prefer direct face-to-face communication rather than communicating through a translator. Of course, there's no shame in that, but after living in a different country for a long time, I feel like people do open up much more when they see that you have taken the time to really try and understand their culture through learning their language. And even if you forget a language later, it's never a waste of time. I think that, there's been studies showing that learning a language can increase your neural connections, basically strengthen your brain and make it stronger, kind of like, exercising a muscle. Finally, I just want to make the point that I think language learning is a great way to build empathy. At least for us English speakers, I think we're so sort of spoiled. We can go to another country and expect to find people who speak our language. However, I think we rarely acknowledge the difficulty of what we're asking. And I think when you're practicing in a foreign language, you are going to always, make mistakes and have people around you that know more than you. And so I think it really forces you to be able to start appreciating something for the journey of learning it. It kind of can help those, I think, perfectionist tendencies getting in the way of our learning. Once you start viewing it, as a marathon, not a sprint, I think that your enjoyment can really grow and you can apply that lesson to anything else that you're trying to learn. Plus, you can have even more empathy for people who are non-native speakers and maybe realize some of the small judgments you might make on people. Anyways, these are my thoughts. Thank you for watching the video. This is really just scratching the surface of Japanese literature, and I could definitely make another video about this topic if it's interesting to you. I'd also, I could also make a language learning video. I don't know. Let me know, I guess, in the comments below what you want to see, and please like the video, subscribe, etc. to support the channel. I have a link to my other videos below, so check that out too. Okay, thank you again. See you next time. Bye.